All right, great. Thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody coming on here and taking the time to do this, especially those who might be in Europe and it's later in the day. So, just to start off, I don't really like looking at myself while I'm doing these presentations. So, if it doesn't look like I'm directly looking at the camera, it's probably because I'm not looking, I don't have this screen on right in front of me. Uh, but what I want to do in terms of talking about these European foreign fighters currently in Syria is related to first providing a little bit of a historical background on foreign fighters and Islamism in general related to it, since I think it's important to understand that context. Then I'll be talking a little bit about the actual current numbers and which countries and some of the key motivations. And then from there, I'm going to discuss some of the issues related to Westerners when they do come back home, especially in the European context, uh, after conflicts such as Afghanistan in the 80s or Iraq last decade and stuff like that. So with that said, I'll start. So since the Syrian protest movement turned into an armed insurrection in the summer of 2011, the Jihad in Syria has become sort of the de jure locale for foreign fighters who want to topple the so-called apostate Assad regime for a variety of strategic, geographic, and religious reasons. According to a study by the Norwegian academic Thomas Hegghammer, between 1945 and 2010, there were about 18 confirmed cases of private global foreign fighter mobilization within the Muslim world. If one were to take into account the stuff from the past 3 years, including the Syrian Jihad, it would be up to about 22 cases now. Uh, of of these, the Syrian Jihad would be considered the sixth large-scale mobilization. And what I mean by that is that there have been more than 1,000 foreigners who have come to a specific fight. Uh, and the ones before that were in Afghanistan in the 1980s, which had about 20,000 individuals. Then you had Bosnia in the 1990s with about 1,000 to 2,000. Then you had Afghanistan in the 1990s with 1,000 to 1,500. And likewise, Afghanistan post 2001 invasion in the U.S. and ISAF, there was 1,000 to 1,500. And then most recently, in terms of large-scale ones, would be the Iraq War last decade, which saw about 4,000 to 5,000 foreigners going abroad. So what's different about foreign fighters in terms of how they differentiate from other Islamist type of movements, where they are in relation to Al-Qaeda or other sort of transnational organizations? According to a study that's been done, it's essentially a new subcurrent within Islamism that's a populist pan-Islamist ideology which emerged in the 1970s as a result of strategic action by marginalized elites employed in nonviolent international Islamic organizations. So how did this process exactly occur? Well, in the 1960s, we started to see some individuals create international Islamic organizations that would help out communities worldwide, with relief, humanitarian aid, and the such. And then in the 1960s, you also saw the repression of many Muslim Brotherhood activists in Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and other places. And many of these individuals were brought into Saudi Arabia, and they were given positions in universities and were able to sort of spread some of their ideas. So within Saudi Arabia, you had this group of activists that were interested in spreading some of these ideologies. And this led to this pan-Islamic focus, and it really wasn't, instrumentalized in terms of being able to do it in a military fashion until the 1980s with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And this led individual entrepreneurs themselves that would then go over and fight on behalf of their imagined ummah or the Islamic community. And this became referred to as the Arab Afghans. And this subset of individuals, which really, the war started in 1979, but many of them did not come until around 1984 and 1985 as it related to Abdul Azam, who was a key ideologue in the mobilization of foreigners going to Peshawar in Pakistan and then going into Afghanistan. These individuals would sort of provide some of the impetus that led to the creation of Al-Qaeda in 1988. So, what distinguishes some of these ideas essentially from previous ideologies? Well, first, the main diagnosis for some of these ideologies was in relation to the fact that they believed that the Muslim nation or the Ummah was in an existential threat. They believed the only way of solving this was to fight back militarily. And the rationale was that all Muslim men worldwide should be able to do this, which was, they believed, required by Islamic law. This was really fully implemented by Abdullah Azzam, who I just mentioned. And what's interesting about Abdullah Azzam is he sort of moved the tick a little bit as related to the interpretation about classical jihad. So in sort of the orthodox understanding, going back to the beginning of, when Islam started, you had the caliphate, and there are different types of jihads. There was an offensive, a defensive one, and then an internal one for oneself. But in terms of a defensive one, because this is what the Afghan jihad would be related to in the 80s, is that the caliph would essentially be the one who would pronounce there being defensive jihad, and those within that specific territory would that were being invaded by a non-Muslim military force would be the ones who would be helping push this back. What Abdullah Azzam essentially did was saying, no, it doesn't just have to be those in that specific country, but everybody in the whole entire Muslim world should be doing this. As a result, he sort of widened that in that regard in many respects. And that's when you started to see numerous individuals starting to trickle in to Afghanistan, and then we saw this on a lower scale level in Bosnia and Chechnya in the 90s, and then, as you all are aware, of course, in Afghanistan and Iraq this past decade. And the Syrian conflict currently is probably going to be one of the largest mobilizations for foreign fighters in the history, going back to the 1980s. At this point, based off of data that I have, I've collected a series of sources in Western media, in Arab media, as well as martyrdom notices on jihadi forums. And put all together, it's probably more than 500 sources. At this current point, from the beginning of the conflict in March 2011 up until about in the past week or so, the last time I updated these figures, there have been about 2,000 to 5,500 individuals who have gone off to fight in Syria with the rebels who are not Syrian. So this would already place the Syrian conflict either in second or third place in terms of the largest mobilizations. As I said earlier, Afghanistan in the 1980s was 5,000 to 20,000, and then Iraq this past decade was 4,000 to 5,000. It's important to note that that the figures are throughout the entire conflict, so it's not just the current present amount, but over the breadth of the conflict. And as I noted, most of the individuals that went to Afghanistan didn't come until about 5 or 6 years after the conflict started. And then when you consider Iraq, most individuals that went over there was over about a 6 to 7 year period, 2003, 2004, until sort of AQI was pushed back with the Sahwa movement, and like by 2009, you really didn't see too many foreigners coming in anymore. But in the case of Syria, most of the foreign fighters didn't start trickling in until last year. So you essentially have had about 2,000 to 5,500 people go within a year, which suggests that the mobilization has been a lot quicker. Some explanations have to do with related to some of the older networks, as it had to do with the Iraq War last decade, since many of the individuals that were foreigners that went into Iraq went in through Syria. So some of these networks were essentially just put back together and reestablished. We really see this in terms of what's going on in North Africa, because if you look at the context of the Arab world, the Tunisians and Libyans are very high up, and then a little lower are the Saudis, and as many are aware, the Saudis were a high amount in the Iraq War, based off of at least the data we have from the Sinjar records. And then in terms of the European context, Europe's obviously a lot closer to this region, and there are many facilitation networks in Europe. that have been burgeoning as it relates to the Iraq War as well, because there were some cases of some Europeans. But additionally, there's sort of these feeder systems in Europe in many respects in terms of recruitment, which sort of differs from the North American context in Canada and the United States. You sort of have these sort of subcultures or that create these movements along the lines of a charismatic figure such as Anjem Chidori in London, who has tried to export this model to some other European countries over the past 5 to 6 years or so. So you sort of have these small groups of individuals that are trying to learn about their so-called, this Salafi ideology, as well as just trying to promote this idea to other people and bring them into the fold. For instance, Anjem Chidori himself was recently just in Finland speaking to a group of individuals that sort of sympathize with this idea, and we've sort of seen a sprouting of groups like Sharia for Belgium, Sharia for Holland, Islam for UK, and a variety of other names within Europe in general. So from there, you already have a potential group of individuals and fight. So you have some of these processes and reasons for why there's been such a large mobilization in that regard. So moving on to sort of what's currently been going on in Syria as it relates to the Europeans themselves, there are three different ways that I've been able to try and analyze these numbers. One in an overall sense, and I already gave you the total figure for all foreign fighters from Europe, Arab world, Southeast Asia, Africa, and North America. But then you could also do it on an overall basis, country by country, as well as just Europe in general. So if you look at Europe in general, you get about 135 to 590 individuals, which would constitute about 7 to 11% of the total foreign fighters from early 2011 until now. It should be noted that there's a range in figures because the nature of trying to get this information is very difficult. Some of it's unverified. So the lower end scale is more of a conservative estimate based off of individuals that can be confirmed either by interviews with individuals in the media or death notices. And then the larger end scale is usually related to figures that governments have put out or intelligence agencies have put out publicly, which is probably accurate on some level but can't be verified. So there's sort of it's sort of more of a liberal approach to it in terms of how many there are. And then in terms of on a country by country basis for Europeans, so I'll just list it off by country. You have one from Albania, you have one from Austria, 14 to 85 from Belgium, 28 to 134 from Britain, one from Bulgaria, 3 to 78 from Denmark, about 13 from Finland, 30 to 92 from France, 3 to 40 from Germany, 26 from Ireland, 1 from Kosovo, 5 to 107 from the Netherlands, 20 to about 30 from Norway, 6 from Spain, and 5 from Sweden. It should be noted that these numbers include individuals that are currently present, those that have been arrested, those that have been killed, and those that have returned home. So this is the overall look at how many people have been there or been involved on some level in these activities. And these numbers are updated up to the end of March. And then we could go from there and drill down further in terms of trying to figure out how many individuals there are currently within Syria in the conflict. I haven't looked at the overall scope of this yet just because this is a new metric that I've been trying to test out. But I drilled it down for the Europeans, and based off of the amount of Europeans that the sources that I've been looking at, it would suggest that about 70 to 440 are still currently in Syria, which suggests that most of the Europeans who have traveled there are still on the battlefield. It should be noted, though, that some of these sources could be dated by this point, and the actual figure could be lower. But if you go by this on a country-by-country basis in terms of who is there now, these are some of the results that I have right now. So in terms of Belgium, it's 4 to 75. Britain, we have 17 to 77. Denmark, we have about 3 to 48. Finland, we got about 12. 9 to 59 in France. 1 to 37 in Germany. 15 to 25 in Ireland. 4 to 104 in the Netherlands. 20 to 30 in Norway. 1 in Spain, and 3 in Sweden. Going from there, we can also try to attempt to see how many individuals might be fighting with jihadists. Of course, this is very difficult since people usually don't raise their hands and say, online that they're fighting with jihadists, though there have been some cases. But there's one way of sort of trying to figure this out in terms of those who have actually died. And thankfully, the jihadis themselves have been self-reporting this. Of course, they might not be self-reporting everything, so this isn't perfect, but it does provide some level of information as it relates to this. So based on notices on al-Qaeda's authenticated forums and jihadi Facebook pages, there have been about 249 foreign martyrdom notices that have gone up in about the past year or so. And of these, there have been 8 identified as being from Europe, which would only constitute about 3% of the total. But as I said, there could be stuff that I've missed or underreported death notices. So it's possible that these figures are higher. And in the case of the European countries, there have been only 1 each from Albania, Britain, Bulgaria, Denmark, France, Kosovo, Spain, and Sweden. So it's still very low on this figure. And in terms of who these guys are fighting with, not all of them, are fighting with Jabhat al-Nusra. They could be fighting with other types of local jihadists, such as the Syrian Islamic Front, which is led by this group called Harakat Ahrar al-Islamiyyah. And then you have other foreigners who might be fighting with these Islamist movements that are more aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood, Ikhwan, or these softer Salafi groups. So there's that. And then there are some that are in independent units like Liwa al-Ummah. This unit was actually set up by some Irish Libyans who went over to Libya when they were fighting the Gaddafi regime about a year or so ago, and then wanted to help out their brothers in Syria. So they went over there and created their own unit, and most of them are Syrians who are in this unit, but it was created by these Irish Libyans who are Islamists, but they aren't jihadists. And then you have some foreigners also that have been freelancing with some FSA units, the Free Syrian Army. But based off of the data in general, it appears that most of the individuals who are dying now, at least, are fighting with jihadists. And this is borne out within the overall data set. When you include people that are from Arab countries or other parts of the world. So with these numbers in mind, why are these individuals sort of going there? Most of these individuals that are going don't start out as these hardcore jihadists or individuals that are sort of sympathetic to al-Qaeda's worldview. Many individuals actually they only pick up some of these ideas once they get there. Many, when they're in Europe still and they're ready to go over to Syria, they look at some of the video on YouTube and the news, the reading stuff, and they see the slaughter and are going more for altruistic reasons because they want to help out their fellow Sunni brethren, because they see them as being not helped out at all by Western governments or even Arab governments for that matter. But once in the field of battle, they then potentially can become exposed to some more of these extreme and radical ideas, and therefore become radicalized on the ground, and then potentially join up with a group like Jabhat al-Nusra, and from there potentially be interested in an attack abroad. With that said, there are definitely some individuals, and we shouldn't underestimate it, that already have these jihadi beliefs before they go over to Syria. So there are definitely some individuals, but we shouldn't paint a broad brush about all people. In addition, just contextualizing sort of the amount of foreign fighters and the overall breadth of the Syrian conflict, you have, if we take the most liberal estimate of foreign fighters over the entire course of the conflict, which is 5,500, and then put that against the most conservative estimate for the current size of the rebel forces, which is maybe about 60,000, foreigners would represent less than 10% of this force, and the actual figure is likely lower. But because many foreigners have potentially fought abroad already in places like Iraq or in Libya or Yemen or Afghanistan, some of them might have a disproportionate impact, especially those from the Arab world, not necessarily those from Europe. But, you know, there have been some Europeans that have fought elsewhere, like the cases of some of the Libyans. So where do we go from here in terms of the potential fallout for this? Uh, there's been a study done by the same academic that I spoke with about earlier, Thomas Heghammer. He recently came out with a study looking at Western foreign fighters in these conflict zones going back to the 1980s Afghan Jihad until about 2010. And he looked at figures from 1990 until 2010. And of these, he was able to calculate there were about 945 total Westerners, including Western Europe, US, Canada, Australia, that have gone abroad to fight. And of these, only 107 of them have been gone home and been involved in plots against the Western nation that they came from, which is about 1 in 9 individuals. Of course, we can't necessarily use this to predict the future about what's going on in Syria, since obviously these numbers can't predict the future, but it does provide sort of this interesting data set that could show us that most of these individuals that have fought abroad have not been interested in attacking their home countries when they have come home. But the difference is though, that based off of the research that Heghammer has done, he's shown that the ones who do return and are involved in some of these plots are usually more dangerous and more lethal than individuals who are just self-starter, homegrown cells within their own countries that have no experience going abroad and just sort of try and do a cell within themselves from their own base. Remember that we shouldn't necessarily be completely concerned, or we should be concerned with those who go abroad to fight in Syria, but we shouldn't think of all these individuals as terrorists or necessarily interested in al-Qaeda's jihad or attacking the West in of itself. Many, like I said, go for altruistic reasons because they want to help out their fellow Sunni brethren. As a result, in terms of a potential way of looking at this, it's more important to focus on those who do return home, and of these, who looks like they're trying to connect with others for planning plots. And if you want to broaden this out a bit, because obviously we're all worried about the context of the United States too, not just Europe. In terms of the Syrian conflict, there's only been 9 individuals we've seen from the United States who have been involved, and one of them I'm sure you might have heard of already is this guy named Eric Haroun, who recently actually flew back to the United States stupidly through Dulles after being all over the media and talking about his times with being with Jabhat al-Nusra, and he's been arrested. So the scale in the United States is just not as much, possibly because there isn't the same type of facilitation networks as we've seen in Europe, and just the fact that Americans in general there just has not been a lot compared with people from the Arab world or Europe going back to last decade or the 1990s for that matter. So this is sort of the basic framework and idea related to what's going on in Syria currently, and I'd be happy to answer some questions now and talk a little bit more about this. And just once again, thank you for taking the time to listen to this. And I think this is a really unique and difficult challenge that we're going to be dealing with for a while, because we're still in many respects only in the first phase of the Syrian conflict, in my opinion. The battle now is of course against the Assad regime, but I see this going on further if and when the regime does fall, which I think it will happen, but I can't provide any timeline because many people have predicted this for a while and nothing's happened yet. But once the regime does fall, whenever that is, then you'll see a lot of fighting within the rebel movement itself. So we could potentially be seeing a lot of fallout from the Syrian conflict for the next, 3 to 5 years, if not decade or so to come. So I think that we're going to be talking about this issue for a while, and especially as it relates to foreign fighters and their impact on the conflict in Syria, but also what this means for when they do come home, because if this rapid mobilization continues to go, in terms of the lower end estimate, it will likely surpass the Iraq War this year, and on the higher end estimate, it's already surpassed the Iraq War, and then from there, it's potential it could get into the lower end estimate territory of the Afghan War in the 1980s, and as we all know, that was sort of the melting pot and place that really created some of the outgrowth of al-Qaeda's global jihadi movement. So with that said, I'll hand it over and let anybody who is interested ask any questions.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and very interesting presentation. For those of you listening, if now's a good time to go ahead and type your questions into the chat box. We'll try and address as many of those as we can during the time allowed. Here's a question for you from Dr. Buffington. Aaron, do you have a sense of what motivates these European foreign fighters? Is it political, like opposition to the Assad despotism? Is it religious, like the Sunni versus Shia? Is it an ethnic thing about the Arab hatred of the Persian influence in Syria? Or are these just thugs, nihilistic anarchists who want to go where the action is, prove their manhood, prove their devotion? What's your feel on their motivation?
There's a variety of motivations, and it all depends on the individual. You can't really say anything with a broad stroke in many respects. Many of the individuals, it appears, though, are interested more for altruistic reasons. They want to help out their fellow Sunni brethren because they see them as being slaughtered by the Assad regime, and therefore they want to just help them out in many respects. There are, of course, some individuals who go for ideological reasons. They believe that they're fighting a jihad against the Assad regime, or they're doing so in a way against the Shia crescent in some respects, because the Assad regime is propped up by the Iranian government and also being helped out by Hezbollah as well. So there is some sectarian angles there for many individuals also. But most of the people that are on the side of the opposition forces that are coming from Europe, it appears, are mostly interested in doing this to help out their fellow Sunni brethren that are being killed.
Okay, and you mentioned that an awful lot about the Sunni Muslims. Are most of the fighters Sunni, or because there's an awful lot of Shia coming from Hizbullah and from Iran, the Revolutionary Guards, and Sadr's militia, or is it predominantly the folks coming in from Europe? Are they mostly Sunni? Is that accurate?
I'm not aware of any cases of European Shia that have gone in to fight with Hezbollah or the Assad regime, or with like the Iranian IRGC, or helping out. It's possible, but there hasn't been much reporting on it. I mean, most of the stuff I study relates to Sunni extremism, so I really only focus on that. There are, of course, Shia foreign fighters in the conflict who are not fighting with the opposition, but fighting with the Assad regime, such as Hezbollah and the IRGC, like I said. But those are mainly coming from Lebanon, Iraq, or Iran, or within Syria itself, I guess.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and granted that there's not a whole lot of Shia in Europe, but just trying to cover all the bases. How about Chechen presence in Syria? Do you see any Chechens going there, or the transfer of the tactical expertise from Chechnya moving into Syria?
I mean, there's been a few cases of some Chechens, nothing widespread. I think that the Chechens are always seen as this huge boogeyman in many conflicts. There's always these rumors about Chechens in Afghanistan or in other places, and there's never been any really good evidence. The Syrian case is interesting, where there has been actual evidence of Chechens, but it's maybe 10 to 12 individuals at most. In terms of technical expertise, most of that would be coming from Iraq in terms of IEDs and individuals who had experience fighting in the Iraq Jihad last decade. So in terms of explosives and all that, most of that transfer is coming through via people's experiences in Iraq.
Okay, thank you. And here's a question, and Mike Gallagher out there in at UCOM asks, you mentioned something called the Syrian Islamic Front. Is this some term that you coined, or is this something that you're used to seeing? Is it an indicator that extremists that are coming in are being consolidated at some level?
The Syrian Islamic Front is an umbrella organization for 6 different rebel forces within Syria. It was originally announced on December 21st last year, but it involves a bunch of groups that were created about a year or so ago, and it's led by al-Sham, which is probably one of the most important fighting forces in Syria right now. They are very much Salafi and also tend to have jihadi sympathies, but they aren't connected to al-Qaeda or sort of the global ideology or network. They're more focused on Syria and local matters. So they're more akin to local jihadists in many respects. And they've been at the forefront of many of the recent battles, like in al-Raqqa or stuff in Deir ez-Zor, Aleppo, and Idlib. They're sort of a broader based movement that have deeper roots within the Syrian community, whereas a group like Jabhat al-Nusra is smaller, and they're more like a special forces, and they usually come in battles. Toward the end is sort of the final push, since many of their fighters don't care about dying too much. So there's that, and both Jabhat al-Nusra and the Syrian Islamic Front do have foreign fighters with them.
Okay, thank you. Have you noticed that any kind of groupings or dispersions, are these European fighters that are coming in, are they focused in any particular area, or what sorts of patterns have you been able to discern?
I mean, it's hard to track specifically since the information changes all the time, and it just depends where some of the larger battles are. But it seems that most are in northern Syria, since many come in through Turkey. So you see individuals in places like Aleppo and Idlib and Deir ez-Zor, which is more in the east, but primarily most of them are in the north because they go through Turkey, whereas you see other fighters from parts of the Arab world that are going in through northern Jordan, so they're located in the south. But I wouldn't be surprised if there are some Europeans in places like Daraa or Damascus as well, which is more in the south. But most of them are in the north, I would say.
Okay, and kind of going back to the organization question, do you see any kind of movements towards a systematic creation of Muslim brigades out of the EU in general or out of particular countries, specifically for sending into the Syrian theater?
You don't see any specific brigades for any like European countries being like this is the brigade from the Netherlands or this is the brigade from France. We've seen a somewhat smaller level scale of this for like the Tunisians or Libyans, but I haven't come across anything related to the Europeans. They're more just embedded themselves within other battalions or brigades, whichever level organization they are with, within, Jabhat al-Nusra or the Syrian Islamic Front or other groups that they might be fighting with, like Kitab al-Muhajirin, which is just a battalion of foreigners.
Okay, and we had kind of talked about it, touched on it before. Do you see any? Granted that you're primarily focused on the European fighters coming in. Do you see to what extent is Iraq officially involved or unofficially sending people to help out the Assad regime? Is there a lot of mixing with the European fighters?
I mean, there's not that much information about the government involvement of Iraq. They've, been quiet, though they have let Iranians use their airspace to provide supplies to the Assad regime. So I guess there's some implicit stuff going on there, but they haven't been overt in their support for the Assad regime in the same way Iran has, or Hezbollah has in that manner. And in terms of the Sunnis in Iraq, I mean, there's been evidence, Jabhat al-Nusra is believed, based off of the U.S. designation, to be created by al-Qaeda in Iraq. But you've also seen uh, a resurgence of al-Qaeda in Iraq itself within Iraq, possibly because there's a destabilization on the border, and there's a variety of local factors going on in Iraq as well, in terms of the Sunni community there feeling neglected from the majority Shia government, and therefore there's been many protests within the Sunni community, but many Sunnis are still very much skeptical of al-Qaeda in Iraq. They obviously don't forget what things were like from 2004 to 2007. But you sort of see this overlap in rhetoric in many respects related to the sectarianism in Iraq and Syria, and you see this also in Lebanon too, in terms of the Sunni community there, because they want to sort of get back at Hezbollah for the takeover of Beirut in 2008, and their perceived sort of slights in general within the political realm in Lebanon.
Okay, and we've got just a little more time for a couple questions. If you'd like to go ahead and get your questions in, folks. While we're waiting for them to type that in, a quick question: as far as the difference between Salafism and Wahhabism, at least to the point where that expresses itself with the fighters coming into Syria, do you have any thoughts on that?
Wahhabism is just one type of Salafi idea. It's Salafism too. It's just the Saudi version of it.
Do you see any of these predominating?
In terms of Salafis, or
Any kind of different variants as they come in from the European fighters versus other fighters that are in the area?
I mean, it's hard to map it out completely, just because not all the information about fighters is that great. I mean, you might get somebody's name or the country they're from, but you won't necessarily get a lot of background information about them. But I will say, in terms of the broader scope, not just Europeans, but all foreign fighters in general, in the beginning, when foreigners were starting to come in, you saw people fighting more with FSA units, whereas in the past 6 to 8 months, you see more foreign fighters in an overall sense fighting with more Islamists or Salafis or jihadis. So you definitely see the sort of that trajectory going on, and we've seen this in general in the Syrian conflict also, in terms of who the best fighters are. I mean, the FSA doesn't have much credibility in many places anymore, and the groups that control parts of the city are usually Salafis or jihadists now, and they're the ones who are have control over the production of heating oil or bread, and just that stuff in general.
Okay. Hey, and just one last question. Do you have a briefing or some notes from this that we might be able to make available to some of our participants?
Yeah. When I was actually preparing this presentation, I wrote something about it. It actually was posted online on Tuesday night by the International Center for Countering Radicalization, ICSR, or Study of Radicalization, I should say, which is based in London. I'm sure people are aware of it. And I could provide a link for that, though. And it pretty much just gives a brief overview of sort of the European context.
Great. I think that'd be much appreciated by the folks that are listening. I think that's about all the time we have for on the questions. Do you have any comments that you'd like to close with?
I mean, I guess the closing thing would just be that we shouldn't necessarily overblow the issue of foreign fighters from Europe, as I said, in terms of, if you go off the past data, only 1 in 9 foreign fighters from 1990 to 2010 went back home and then were involved in a plot against a Western nation. So I wouldn't say that all these individuals are going to end up becoming these global jihadist terrorists. So in terms of advice for European governments or intelligence agencies, they obviously should be monitoring people that are coming home, but also be discriminate in who they're focusing on, how they go about cracking down on potential individuals that are involved in a plot, but not going after everyone, because some people might just go home and go back to their daily life and go back to their cubicle, and that's all. So that's the primary thing. And just once again, thanks for your time, and I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much.